Resident Evil 8 is finally out, and to be perfectly honest, it's awesome. So I'm just gonna kind of give my general thoughts on the game. There aren't many spoilers in this review at all. To see any, so don't worry about having anything like the main story spoiled. The main thing I'm just going to be kind of showing off today is just general gameplay of an earlier area in the game, as well as just kind of showing what it plays and feels like. So the first thing I want to really comment on the game is it plays a lot like Resident Evil 7 had a baby with Resident Evil 4, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Resident Evil 4 and 7 are both incredibly good games. So like in Resident Evil 7, it takes place entirely in first person, however like Resident Evil 4, it is a lot heavier on the action. This isn't necessarily a bad thing though. See, the problem with Resident Evil 7 that I always felt was that the enemy design was lacking and that the combat was too far and few between. This left many patches of the game feeling dull and repetitive, particularly the sections where there wasn't much going on. This is not to say, however, that Resident Evil 7's gameplay didn't shine in its moments. There were many times in Resident Evil 7 where I was terrified, or delighted, in fact. You know, such as earlier encounters with Jack Baker when he is chasing you throughout the house. He is an unstoppable force, and however he may be chasing you and be unkillable, it still felt like a consistent threat that pushed you further through the game. This being said, there is a very similar mechanic in Resident Evil 8 with a few of the enemies throughout certain locations. Resident Evil 8, however, does also do a few things different than Resident Evil 7. The first and main thing I would like to point out that it does differently is the crafting system. Whereas in Resident Evil 7, there was a little bit of crafting, but not a lot, to be perfectly honest. Like, a lot of the times you would end up having most items using the same ingredients, whereas they've definitely expanded upon it in Resident Evil 8. There was the other issue with Resident Evil 7 was that you could only craft certain types of ammo and equipment, whereas in Resident Evil 8 you can basically craft weapon ammo for all of your gear, which is very good, as there's a very neat and tight crafting menu. Puzzles do make a welcome return though. Quite a few of them require you to use your brain a bit. Like the piano puzzle being shown on screen right now, having to know what the notes are and then play them. I'm not the best at playing piano, so reading notes was never that good for me. But for someone who's like an expert pianist, this might be a welcome change. There are many puzzles like this throughout Resident Evil 8 as well that really make you think. So if you like playing Resident Evil games with the puzzle, you will not be disappointed here. One thing a lot of people have said about Resident Evil 8, which I can kind of agree with but kind of disagree with, is it isn't as scary as Resident Evil 7. This is true apart from one particular section in the game, which I won't spoil in this review, but let's just say that particular section had me shaking in my boots. So as you can see, like in Resident Evil 7, there are still stalker enemies that chase you throughout locations, this time taking the form of Lady Dimitrescu, or Domitrescu as some of the characters refer to her in the game. It's a very inconsistent name actually, because it's neither spelled Dimitrescu nor Domitrescu, it's actually spelled Dimitrescu, hence why a lot of people pronounce it that way, but I'm completely waffling on. The main thing is, though, she does what most stalker-type enemies in the Resident Evil games do. She pushes you through the location, hoping that you go to the next location, and never making you feel quite safe. This being said, there are still enemies in the area that can be fought and killed, such as general ghoul enemies, and mini-boss fights involving her daughters. So these usual mini-bosses are a bit more clever, requiring you to solve a solution in order to damage them, this being shining a light on them or opening a window making them vulnerable. The first time it took me to work these out, I was running around for a few moments like a headless chicken, quite afraid. But after a while, you kind of work them out, and they go down all the same. And of course, if you kill enemies, they now drop items which can be sold to the Duke, this game's version of the Merchant from Resident Evil 4. He'll buy basically anything you give him, with the exception of like 2 or 3 items. This is particularly useful as there are a lot more weapon variety and equipment variety in Resident Evil 8 compared to Resident Evil 7, which was one of its other lacking features, was a lack of weapon design. This being said, there are only variants of certain weapons, like your shotguns, your pistols, and your magnums. I am a little disappointed that I couldn't find a better sniper rifle later on in the game. But that's primarily because I like the sniper rifle. So the area in question that I'm showing off is the castle. This is one of the earlier and arguably coolest locations in the game. It's very nicely detailed, it looks incredibly great with its dim lighting and gothic atmosphere, and yet it has that nice sense of unease and dread that I like in my Resident Evil games. It also has a nice idea that all of the characters talk to each other. You have random moments like this where Dimitrescu summons her daughter to scold her for not killing Ethan yet. It feels very organic and very real, which makes the game much more believable in a long term. Well, as believable as you can about tall vampire ladies chasing you through castles. But at the same time, even though she's all over the marketing, she's hardly actually in the game after the first 2 hours. I was rather surprised to find out that she doesn't play a big role in the story like everyone speculated she did. One other key feature about this game that I absolutely love is the fact that it can be played entirely in New Game Plus mode. This basically means that when you finish the main campaign, you can take all of your upgraded guns and equipment straight for a fresh play through the game, making harder difficulties much more accessible and much easier. This being said, if you are the masochistic type, you can just do a fresh save on the hardest difficulty and go in completely blind. As I mentioned before, puzzles and unique items around the location do make an appearance in Resident Evil 8, and it is a very welcome appearance, to be perfectly honest. Some puzzles really had me thinking and scratching my head, whereas others had me genuinely questioning what to do. Some are easy, some are obvious, but most of them are just to progress further in the story or to unlock hidden treasures. But they usually require an item or two. This being said, I will confess that some puzzles are quite devious at times. The other thing that Resident Evil 8 does particularly well, that I do like to comment on, is its actual titular village location. This acts as a kind of a central hub for the game, effectively connecting all of the different areas that you go back and fight the different characters in, which is another place where Resident Evil 8 shines. The village is isolated and eerie, with a cold sense of dread, as terrifying lycans, these werewolf-type creatures, stalk the village, praying to hunt down Ethan. They're quite clever enemy AI. They will pounce, they will hunt, they will flank. They'll attack and retreat on command. They'll try and dodge your shots to make it much harder to kill them. They'll even open doors, unlike the previous molded designs. Overall, I really like the designs of the lycans, and I find them incredibly intimidating, as well as just nice to fight against. There are some much more interesting variants of enemies later on in the game, but I don't particularly want to spoil some of the surprises down the road for you. The one thing, probably the only downside about the game that I would consider is that there's one particular section that I find drags on a little bit too much. However, everything that happens immediately after that section is incredibly good. It's a bit like the boat section in Resident Evil 7. It doesn't overly spoil the experience, it just feels like a bit of a letdown in what's been a consistently good game. Just like Resident Evil 7, it is primarily about exploration and getting from location to location, using key items and solving puzzles. However, it is a lot more combat heavy with a different variety of weapons. Some things are back from Resident Evil 7, such as shotguns, handguns, grenade launchers, while other weapons like the flamethrower are absent. A machine gun, for example, that you get in the story of Resident Evil 7 is an in-game unlock, which you then can play the entire game with after. This is a little bit of a downside, as the whole time throughout my playtime I was wondering, I wonder when I'll be able to buy or find a machine gun, and it never sadly happened. However, this game feels a lot more like an RPG than a survival horror game. This is because you can not only upgrade your weapons and guns this time around, you can also upgrade Ethan himself. Throughout the world you're going to find different animals and monsters and creatures to hunt and kill for their sweet meats. These meats can then be given to the Duke to create recipes that will give stat increases, such as speed, making your block more effective, or increasing Ethan's health. This makes the game feel much more organic and encourages exploration and just an urge to look around everywhere, checking for every nook and cranny possibly imagining. Some enemies are a little more tough to deal with, but they go down all the same. Nothing is truly unkillable in this game, which is nice, so if you have the tools and the patience for it, you will be pleasantly rewarded. That being said, there are also several mini-bosses hidden throughout the map to find. Killing them will net you big treasure and rewards, so be sure to explore the entire village, which is absolutely massive. I do also like the fact that you consistently return to the village, so you might not have a key item the first visit, but then you might have it later on in the game. This will make return visits to the village more like a sense of unlocking and progress. If I had to rate the game overall, given that I pretty much praised everything about it with one or two exceptions, it would be quite solid. I would definitely recommend it to a fan of Resident Evil. So it's a 9 out of 10 from me. But anyway, I'm hoping that you are now encouraged and hoping to play Resident Evil 8, and if you already own it and you're enjoying it, tell me what you think. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe, and I will hopefully see you on the next episode. I've been Kashmir Nikita. Thank you so much for watching today.